Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant. In this podcast, we're hoping to explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week's podcast is sponsored by the finest cup of coffee in Oxfordshire because it's a cold winter morning.
Well, more importantly, it's also because we have our first guest, and so we had to roll out the best coffee that we had. We're very pleased to say that we have our first guest with us today, and his name is John Cresswell. And just to introduce him, he joined the Army 25 years ago as a gunner, and because that wasn't hard enough apparently, he chose to do the All-Arms Commando course, which gave him the right to wear the green commando beret worn by the Royal Marines. He then went on to command 29 Commando Regiment, the Commando Gunners, so those are the gunners who work very closely with the Royal Marine Commandos, and is now the Deputy Commanding General of the 1st French Infantry Division, which has over 33,000 soldiers in his organisation. So if ever there was someone to come and talk about the perils, the joys, the pitfalls of leadership, management and running an organisation, I think John is the right one. And just to finish off, you always have to go and try and find something that your guest has said. And in the time-honoured fashion, I crawled his LinkedIn profile and I found something which actually I might have to steal for myself, where talking about his role, he said, "It's to ensure my organisation and its people are confident in their roles, proficient in their skills and resolute in their delivery." And if that's not a good statement from a leadership perspective, then I don't know where. So welcome John Cresswell to the podcast.
Guys, great to be with you today. Thank you.
The topic I wanted to sort of start on today was one that came from me, I think, and whether or not we get through all of these or not, whether we do the inevitable, we'll do this in another episode. I wanted to talk about fear, uncertainty, and adaptation, and to give a little bit more colour to it. I think if you start with fear, military fear or fear in the armed forces is a bit of a cliche in the sense that everyone understands it. There is imminent danger. There are people with explosives. There's all these reasons why you would, of course, imagine why there would be fear. Lots of books have been written, films have been made. But what I thought was really interesting when I thought about it is if you now think about business, I don't think I really hear people talking about fear. I almost wonder whether it's you're not allowed to talk about fear.
I think there are a lot of conversations now about imposter syndrome, and I think that relates very closely to fear. So whether people are talking about fear but not actually mentioning the word, I don't know. But I think there's a close relationship between imposter syndrome and the uncomfortable situation you might find yourself in a position within the workplace. And I think that there's an interesting dynamic when we go back to the military idea of fear. You've obviously mentioned the physical aspect, the danger, which I think is very visceral and people will be very aware of. But from my experience, and I don't know how John feels about this, that fear definitely exists when you're in dangerous situations. But you have coping mechanisms, you put that to the back of your mind, you get on with the job. But I find the fear of being in a position of command and the fear of being exposed, of being in a situation where you're not qualified, is a much more challenging aspect of the job.
Well, this is why I wanted to talk about it, because I think there's, as you've talked about, there's the fear of not being good enough, there's the fear of letting others down, and there's the fear of change. And in a minute, I want to talk about just the emotion of fear in itself is natural and understandable, but I don't know how valuable it is, as it were. But I want to talk about what we do to counter it and what we do beyond. But before we do that, we have a guest, and I love the idea. If someone said to me, "Congratulations, Chris, you're now going to become the Deputy Commanding General of not just a British division, but a French division with 33," how how did you approach that job? I'm not suggesting there was fear, but how did you feel when they handed you the slip of paper that said congratulations?
Well, thank you indeed, Chris. There was fear. There was fear, of course, for the very reasons that you've both set out. And I love the simplicity of the challenge of this subject, which reveals itself to be so complicated in all its textures. And you're right to say, fear is natural. I had some sort of vision as you spoke about the nature of fear, and I thought about taming a wild horse. What do you do? Do you ignore the horse? Do you let it run off thinking, I'm not capable? Do you try and tame the horse? Do you back the horse? Do you transform the horse into something different? Fear as this emotion, as this force, which can be harnessed for good, I think is really interesting. You've got a great subject here. Back to your question, how did I feel? Well, I was over the moon at the opportunity to go and work with our French colleagues. It's been I'll say this most genuinely, and you'll say I've got Stockholm syndrome, but it's been the most extraordinary experience of my career to date. It has been fantastic working with great people, but doing everything you do in a foreign language, it changes everything. Fear, I'm scared stiff at times. How do I manage that?
Yeah.
Is the question, I think.
Well, I think that's really important, because that was the point I wanted to make, which is, and by the way, the reason why this comes up is because I've felt that. I've been in situations where I've started a role and all of a sudden someone says, these are the things you have to do, these are the problems you solve, and as an experienced person I realised we are where we are after many years of an organisation sort of going down that road, so it's not easy to change. But the bit that was interesting is exactly what you said, John, which is there's a risk. I'm going to say, I think you should embrace the fear, as I grew up, it was this idea that to be scared of something was somehow bad. And I think that's not useful. It's okay to be worried. I think the point that you just made, John, is what do you do to overcome that fear? Or actually, how do you turn that fear into something useful? And I think that there's a couple of things that occur to me. And again, I think both of you have some interesting real world example of this. But the first thing is training.
Yeah.
I think training and experience, I guess those are different forms of the same thing, which says I may not have come across this exact situation, but I have sufficient evidence for myself that I have done something similar, or even survived or thrived in something, or failed, but actually I've learnt from that. So that I think that's the first thing is, in fact, rather than sort of talking about experience, the first thing is to confront it and say, okay, what am I going to do about this? How do I turn this into a positive, and how do I think about this?
I think there's a really interesting sort of human dynamic, part of the human condition, which is that we are more scared of uncertainty and the unknown than we are of things that we do know about, even though we might know that they're incredibly dangerous. And your point about training means that the physical risk of combat operations, although dangerous situations are scary places, I certainly never found that the fear was paralysing, because we'd emulated that danger on exercises through training, and I was very aware of the risks, and I felt somehow more in control. Whereas I think all of the things we've been talking about, taking on new jobs and new roles, there's a huge amount of fear of failure and fear of uncertainty, which is just innate in us, isn't it? That it overwhelms us.
But I think there's a really interesting difference there, which is when we talked about fear of roles, I think the point is the variables that could present themselves to us when we start a new role are very high. You know, you've got lots of people, you can't predict the situation, as opposed to here is a task which I've done many times before and I can prep. Yeah. So it's almost, I don't know that you can practice those things, but you know, John, what did you do to prepare? You know, you're packing your bag to jump in the car to drive south to France. How did you mentally prepare yourself?
I prepared, and I think the conversation to date has brought this. You've talked about experience, but it's knowledge. It's fear of the unknown. So I needed to prick that bubble I needed knowledge. I needed to understand. I needed to understand my role. I needed to understand where I was going. And I needed, in terms of French language, a level of proficiency in military French, in technical French, to allow me to do my job. So it was fear of the unknown. I needed to transform the unknown into something I could manage, and that was through knowledge, through learning, finding out what I needed to know to understand.
So this is a very mundane question, but that's really interesting. How do you know what your role is? So as someone who hasn't had the career in the military that you have, for me to start a new job, I go talk to my CEO and we spend a couple of hours and I talk to various other senior people in the organisation to effectively figure out what my role is, what the rhythm is. How do you do that when you're joining effectively another army in another language? How did you know what your role was going to be, or did you turn up and, as it were, figure it out on the job?
Well, it's both, of course. In terms of the formal articulation of your role, in terms of any organisation, it's set out. It's set out. You apply for a job, and here is the job specification. That's not the uncertainty. The uncertainty in reality is the ecosystem you're joining, not the two-dimensional organisation that's set out on an org chart. It's how things happen in reality, the relationships, how you are perceived. Where is your leverage? How do you persuade? What are your levers? Those are the things you need to understand. So the answer to your question is both. I was very clear on what my role was going to be, what my role is today. But the deeper textures, the layers of how the organisation functions, how the organisation thinks and goes forward, how it makes its decisions, that is not apparent. And certainly in an overseas culture, in a different culture, well, yes, you do learn as you arrive.
So I think this is an interesting time to flip it around as well. So I don't have sort of that 33,000 people, different country, but I've been very lucky. I've worked in a smaller organisation that was acquired by a much larger organisation. So rather than my fear purely around what that would mean, what was really interesting was an institutional fear of change. So rather than it being one person worried about what the future would bring, there was 130 of us who were worried about what the future would bring. And so I think that an interesting way to talk about the fear is not just how you feel, but how other people in the organisation feel. And the thing that's really interesting to me that I have seen on a number of occasions, and I can only assume in your careers even more, is people are watching you as a leader and actually saying, how's this going to work out for us? And so they look to you and say, knowing, as we've discussed, you turn up on the first day at work. And I do remember this from a job where I turned up on the first day at work and my team literally was sitting there on the end of a Zoom call looking at me going, so what now? In fact, I think those were the exact words. What are we going to do now? And so what's really interesting is how, when you're nervous and you're worried, how do you mask is the wrong word. How do you interact with other people? Because the first thing you can't do is turn up and say, well, I'm really worried about this. I have no idea how it goes. So there's this idea, I don't know, Gareth, whether you've got any experience, you as a troop commander, having been out to Afghanistan, the first time you went out to your first warfighting troop, how did that feel the first time you stood in front of them, and what did you do? How did you set the right tone and tempo, even though I'm pretty sure inside you were thinking they're gonna laugh at me?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there's a point in there that I want to come back to in terms of organisational fear. But in response to your specific question, I left training and went straight to 4-5 Commando up in Arbroath in Scotland, and took over a troop that we knew was deploying to Afghanistan within 6 months. And I had sleepless nights thinking about my first formal introduction to the troop. That moment where the old troop commander says, thanks for everything, goodbye, here's your new boss. And I despite all of the anxiety about going on operations and doing the job, the thing that scared me most was that first interaction. And I thought about what I was going to say, and I rehearsed it in my head. I think I even wrote, notes down. And when it came to it, it was a Friday afternoon, and all the lads wanted to do was get on the road and go home for the weekend, and they had very little interest in what I had to say. And I think it comes back to your point about personal narratives, about empathy, and about understanding the relation between what you're trying to communicate and what other people are receiving. Because I needn't have worried, because it's old hat to them. They had seen many bosses come through. It wasn't that big a deal. But for me, this was the scariest moment.
But what was your? I mean, I think that's very well said. That it turns out that most of these things have happened before, and they've been through it all before, and it's us placing our own spotlight on our own fears. But what was the first thing you said to them? I mean, what?
I can't remember, because it was such an insignificant moment in my troop command, and we went through so much that has kind of faded in memory. But I probably stuttered out something that was pompous and wholly inappropriate, but yeah, I honestly can't remember.
There's a lovely question, and I'm going to ask you about this in a second, John, because I think the more senior you get, the word I'm going to use becomes more dangerous, which is, I'm a big believer in finding the right level of vulnerability. Now, what I don't mean is to say, hey everyone, I don't know whether I can do this. What I do mean though about vulnerability is particularly honesty. So I've been in places where you say things are not great, because if I say things are great, they immediately go ding ding ding. You either don't understand or you're lying to us, and so I think that I've always tried to be genuine and honest from the start, because that way there's no second. There'll be no slipping of the mask. There's no the next day where it turns out we thought you were one thing. But what about for you, John? What was how do you approach that vulnerability? As someone as senior as you are, what is? I don't know if this is the right word. What's appropriate vulnerability?
It's a brilliant question, and I'm just coming back to what you said about when you turn up at an organisation. The challenge of showing your fears, but of course you can, and I think you should. But it's how you articulate those, and the further you go up the ladder, I think the easier it is. It enables you. Let's go back to Gareth's example, which I've been in as well. I shared exactly the same experience. If you are a troop officer, a lieutenant, stood in front of your Marines or commando gunners with your troop sergeant next to you, and you start asking silly questions about how the radio works or how the GPMG feeds in its rounds or whatever, then you're going to lose credibility, because that is your job. However, as you go up, we'll decide how far you think you need to go up. But certainly where I find myself now as the gunner commander of the division, I can ask those stupid questions, especially in another nationality. I can say, could you explain to me, please, how your rifle works? Could you explain to me, people, please, how your radio works? I can ask silly questions. I say silly questions, but what I'm trying to do is get people to talk to me. So how did I address this? Because I share that experience that Gareth has articulated, and I've gone through it recently, as you've shown. And I've suddenly realised people want to talk. How do I enable people to talk to me? How do I unbottle it? Now, some of it, I am asking genuine questions, because I don't know. And the best way to find out something you don't know is to ask somebody that does. So it doesn't matter what rank they are. So throw away your inhibition or your pride and say, I don't know. For me, that is a degree of vulnerability. I don't know, agree. Please explain. But by doing that, you empower the speaker.
Well, I think we're going back to this sort of first thing of fear and how you deal with it. Because the first thing is, if all of a sudden all you can think about is fear, you're actually in a bit of trouble. But what you've just started to talk about is tactics and methods by which you overcome it. And the first statement is, you think about how you're going to solve whatever the problem is, or how do you understand the problem. So I think I am a huge fan of questions. Throughout my career, the smartest people are the ones, if you go back in time, rewind what they said, they asked really interesting questions. So actually, your question about how does this gun work, I mean, at one level, you know exactly how the gun works. You've worked with many guns. But what you're actually potentially doing, I don't know if this is with your intention, is does this soldier understand how his gun works? How does this soldier interact with a senior officer? Actually, what you're doing is you are getting a broader picture, and the question is merely a vehicle. And I think building off that, the vulnerability to build empathy, the next thing that I always think that people want to know about. So in that first example, let's say whether it's your troop, Gareth, or John, when you have sort of whichever's the first poor platoon that's rolled out in front of the general that's just arrived from the UK, the one thing which I am very, very aware of is that informally, this is an audition. It's not just they're auditioning for you. Is this a competent organisation? Who are the skilled operators? How do they work? But the bit that I think is more interesting for this conversation is they are auditioning you. And going back to the thing about how you perceived, your troop will have gone to the pub with their mates from another troop and has said, "As your new boss then," and then has said, "He's an idiot," or
almost certainly,
or actually he was all right, and likewise. And I think we talked about narrative in previous episodes. One of the things I've learned as I've gone through my career is that every meeting, no matter how seemingly insignificant it is an audition and feeds back into this thing. And it's this loop of, if they think that you have a fighting chance of solving the problems, all of a sudden they're on your side. The moment they say, this guy turned up, looks like a frightened rabbit, doesn't know what he's doing, hasn't prepared, all of a sudden your problem has doubled in size now because you have to bring the rest of the team with you.
I think I want to pick up on what John said about as you climb higher up in an organisation, you have the ability to expose sort of ignorance around tactical problems, how the rifle works or whatever. I think there's two really important aspects, which is you are establishing your credibility by proving your competence in what you are supposed to be there to do, and the vulnerability then comes in when it's about solving the problems that the organisation needs to solve. And I think at a very low level, you're dealing with relatively simple problems. And the higher up the organisation you go, the more complex the problems become. And therefore, it's not about knowing the answers, it's about leading the organisation to find the answers. Yeah. So your point, John, about if you don't know how your rifle works as a troop commander, you're going to lose credibility. And I remember on one of my first sort of tests, I suppose, was I found myself in Norway. We did an Arctic winter deployment before we went to Afghanistan, and I was lost. I got my troop lost somewhere in northern Norway. In the middle of the night, and I was again frozen with fear that I'd failed. That really early on in my career, I'd got my troop lost. This was my job, and I couldn't do it, and this was going to be, potentially the end of my troop command, the end of my career. And of course, it wasn't. Getting lost in the Arctic, navigating the Arctic, is quite a difficult thing to do. And when I eventually
turn left at the tree.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's only trees. This is the problem. There's only white mountains and trees, and everything looks the same. So it's like micro navigation. You're having to use compass bearings, but it took me a lot of time and a lot of courage to ask my troop sergeant and my section commanders to help me, and we very, very quickly, as a team, worked out the answer. And no one thought anything of it. But in my mind, this was my job and I'd failed. And in reality, my job was to work with the team to solve this problem. And I suspect, John, I'd like to get your opinion on this. You're now in a position where you're not solving simple problems or even complicated problems, but you're solving complex problems, that interaction between culture, command, the task, the team.
We've talked about this, and I think for people who, whether you're at a sort of the beginning of your career or more senior in your career, what you've just talked about is empowering your team to be successful. You have lots of people around you have skills and experience you don't have. There's almost this cliche that as a leader you have to have all the answers, and we were talking about this morning. As a leader, actually, that is specifically not what you need to have. If you have it, that's fantastic, but you need to convince your people that you will lead them to the right decision, and by doing so you use other people. So
I think absolutely, and I think we're getting to this point in the conversation where we're seeing a difference between leading doers, a simple transaction, please do this for me, and a task is done, versus leading thinkers. So now we've got a problem on the table and we're empowering a team to come up with a solution. This brings us to the word of the moment, diversity. But I don't mean that in a politically correct type sense, though it is applicable. I mean that in a thought, experience, understanding sense. A brainstorming approach with a wide variety of experiences, of cultures, of thoughts, I believe gets you to a solution, or at least a platform from where a solution might be derived. Maybe that solution is a negative. It is a decision not to do something. But having an optimum group of people thinking, bringing a diverse viewpoint, series of viewpoints, I think gets you quickly to a point. But that doesn't mean the group makes the decision.
That is so well said. So, we haven't talked about product management this episode, and I think it's important we do, because I know that's what everyone really cares about. But this was something as a product manager. So one of the premises of this podcast is that the world of the military and business is actually more simply than I think. So typically you'll work in Scrum, which is a methodology, and there'll be a team which is a team of a product manager who will be the voice of the customer and decide what to build. You'll have engineers who will go away and build it, testers to go and test it, and designers to help design a great experience. So look, there we go. Lots of people with experience you bring together. And when I was a young product manager, someone wisely said to me, you should use your team because they know things that you don't know. And as a green junior product manager, what I thought that meant was we should, in effect, do things by committee. So we would go around the room and we would say, should it be red or blue? And someone would say, I think it should be red. Someone else, I think it should be blue. I think it should be orange. And it turns out that we weren't successful. But your point about the leader role was the moment that this was resolved for me was when I realised it's really valuable and important to get that feedback from the rest of your team, have the diversity of ideas, explore things you haven't explored, but everyone has a role. And weirdly, everyone is actually far more comfortable when they're in the role. So what I realised was, rather than this being by committee, and you really don't want to get me onto a story about how I've seen product managers product managed by committee. By the way, I never did that. The role was you went around the room and said, this is the problem we're trying to solve. How could we solve it? And everyone would say, red, blue, orange, white. And you would say, thank you for your input.
Yeah.
I'm the person accountable. Here's the decision I'm going to make and why. Engineer, please now go away and solve that problem for yourself. Designer. And actually, all of a sudden, rather than fearing that everyone would say, but I want it to be orange or blue, they all went, great, thank you for that decision. Whether we agree with it or don't agree with it, that's not important now. You heard us. You listened, you used your experience, and then we went ahead, we made a decision, moved forward. So from a product management perspective, that was such an important thing, was we all have roles. Those roles not only protect us, they enable us. And rather than this assumption that if someone disagrees, that's bad, this structure of having a role means people go, no, that's great. I know what my role is. I know what your role is. Boss, if you told me how to clean my weapon and how to pack my rucksack, I'd get a bit annoyed. But the fact you're telling us where to go. And I wonder whether there's, again, that's another really good example of, if you flip that over into the military world, your perfect example, which was you said to your team, Gareth, okay, where are we? What are we going to do? But at the end of the day, you still said, thank you. Yes, we are here. This is where we're going to go. So it's that combination, which I think is really important.
The point you've highlighted there, coming back to fear, is the leader has taken the burden of fear from the team.
That's such a good point.
I think the word you used was accountability, and I think that's so crucial, because half of the challenge is not only recognising that you have a challenge to solve, but also who in the organisation needs to solve it. And of course, as a troop commander, I had very simple challenges. I've got to get to a certain place by a certain time in order to carry out a certain activity. You have lots of sub-teams, sub-units, sub-organisations. So how do you balance what is your challenge that you need to be the leader of, and how do you recognise other people's challenges when you need to delegate that out?
You must listen. But that ultimately is the job of the leader. And I do think analysing what we mean by leader is really interesting. There's no word for leader in French. It's really interesting. There's no word for leader or leadership. I'm not going to go into the George Bush joke about the French don't have a word for entrepreneur, but that doesn't mean the concept doesn't exist, of course. They would use command, I think, or direct. So the concept is very much there, but it's a notion of what is a leader, and I've just been doodling here, because I think it's a fundamental difference between a leader who is there to motivate people to do something, versus a decision maker who is going to take a decision, which I think militarily we'd say is command. That is which is not necessarily directly linked to the motivation aspect, because you might be a very good commander but not a very good leader. You also need somebody in this triumvirate that manages resource. But where I'm taking this to is there is a danger that you might lead people in the wrong direction. You might lead people without thinking about the resource, in which case you run out of road, fuel, whatever. So you need to have a thinker, you need to have a motivator, and you need to have a banker. If you are not all three, you need to recognise which one you are and buy the other two.
Well, these are the moments which make me smile in these, when you think, here's a thing I've come across in my career and it must be unique, and of course it's not unique. You have just described how venture capitalists sit down with organisations that they have just funded, and they say exactly what you have just said, and they add a little bit more layers to it, but the principle is exactly that, which is they are typically working with organisations where there is a founder who has been all of those things and has compensated. They're strong at some things. Typically, they're strong at the motivation. To be a founder, you have to go and pitch the business. But as you become more mature, exactly that, you need to sit down and say, well, what skills do we need? And let's separate those out. And so they talk in terms of CEOs. There are some CEOs that are the thinkers, but are dreadful in person. As in, don't send them out to the investors, don't send them out to the customers. We will go and find someone who becomes that figurehead. So it's so interesting that you say that. But of course, my flip side is, in organisations, and when you've got scaling businesses, you can say, well, I'm going to hire a person who's my chief operating officer, there's lots of roles that can do this. How does that happen in the military? So how do your statement, which I think is bang on, which is, as a leader, you have to understand where your skills are. You have to understand that you need a certain set of skills for the organisation to be successful. And where you don't have those skills, you need to find the people to do it. How do you have that in what I would assume is a relatively rigid organisation? I can't believe the military says, well, you should have the thinker, you should have the person who goes onto Facebook. And how does the military approach this? Or does it?
Well, I love what you say about the military being a rigid organisation, because I'm in the military and I don't regard it as a rigid organisation. I see the outer shell as looking rigid. I see the structure as being strong, like the beams of a ship creaking in a storm. But within it, I see nothing but agility.
So talk about that, because and to be fair, I've because I know enough people in the military, I know there's a lot more. But the perception from outside of the military is the military follows orders. There will be orders for everything, and indeed there are orders for everything. But talk more about what latitude you have for agility. So in your career, in your experiences, where have you had to follow a path because that's the path that's written, versus how much and where do you are told, here's a blank piece of paper, go, the outcome and the mission is the most important thing. What must you do to be successful?
I'd widen it to help me with this answer, to say life is about a series of boxes, of Russian dolls. I think in our general existence, and I mean, the three of us sat here, we are bounded by the law. We are bounded by policy. We are bounded by ethics. And so gradually, with these rules which govern our lives, we create room for manoeuvre. And it's the same in military life. And that's why I talk about agility. I see nothing but agility in what I do. The key thing I look for is, what is my room for manoeuvre? How can I create the optimum room for manoeuvre in terms of the various constraints, positive or negative, which govern the activity that I'm engaging? It could be financial, it could be legal, it could be ethical, it could be a whole number, it could be time. What is my room for manoeuvre? And once I've established my room for manoeuvre and tested that room for manoeuvre, then I have complete freedom to do whatever I need to do to deliver the outcome. The final part of that answer will be me as a leader, as a commander now, because that's what I need to do for my subordinates. Yeah. I need to give them this box, this manoeuvre box, should we call it, a conceptual thinking box. There you are. That is your box to operate in. I will protect everything around it. Leave everything around it to me. Within that box, you are the master.
We've talked about this on the podcast before. I think there is the Hollywood perception of the military, which is all about sergeant majors shouting at people. It's very rigid, it's very structured, there are rules for everything. And then there is the reality that you've just described, John, and that chimes very much with my experiences as well. And I think we are dancing around the concepts of leadership, management and command.
Yes.
Where leadership, as you say, is about inspiring people to do things. Management is the allocation of resources, whether that's time, money, petrol, whatever. But the key thing is command, which is the structure that allows people to recognise where they apply leadership and management. And that's those boxes that you're talking about, I think.
Exactly.
It's the delegation of authority, accountability and responsibility, and making sure that that's very explicit. And I think in the military, this is something that is done very, very well, is that command structure, who owns the decision, who owns the responsibility, who is accountable, is very, very clear. Whereas I think in the commercial world, sometimes that gets a little bit lost.
I think so. So I think I would agree with you, because I think, and not because sort of business is somehow missing a trick. I think we have to remember how businesses evolve and grow.
Yes.
So when you're a small organisation, the idea of who is accountable, well, we're all accountable, those lines are purposely blurred for success. But the challenge comes with typically with organisations is when they scale, there's almost this belief that, well, what worked last year will work this year. And all of that means is that it's much harder for organisations institutionally to start thinking about the accountability, responsibility. But I think those things are there and they are very important. I mean, again, it's interesting. As I've been interviewed for jobs over the years, people talk about sort of what's your, whether it's leadership style or anything like that. One of the things that people have talked about, I say, is my job is to provide vision, strategy, a goal, constraints, and then empower people to do that and coach people to do that. And I think that's a business way of saying effectively what you guys have said as well.
I think there's also a really important bridge here, which is what I term as the dialogue of command. This does not happen in isolation. There have to be bridges between these boxes, these freedom boxes, these conceptual boxes we've talked about, empowering people with a task or a mission, resources and a time block, i.e. when you want it done by. But this is not happening in isolation, and there must be a dialogue, and this is the expression of risk, and this brings us back full circle in terms of fear. The absolute obligation of the empowered subordinate, if that's a term we want to use, to go back to the task giver and say, that I can do, that I can't guarantee, and this is what I need in addition. This dialogue of command, and this is the expression of risk, because the objective is not being delivered by the subordinate. The subordinate, the empowered person, is delivering the task, but the objective is owned by the person that gives it, by the leader, by the manager that gives the task, and therefore it is incumbent on the subordinate to make sure the manager, the commander, the leader understands the level of risk associated with what is happening.
You've got this brilliant question, which is, should the task, the goal, we want to sell $1 million, we want to assault that hill, should the task ever change based on the feedback from the subordinates? So where I come from, the statement is, we need to grow by $1 million, $100 million, whatever the answer might be. That is the outcome, full stop. And any answer that doesn't achieve that outcome is considered the wrong answer. I think there's an interesting statement that says, do you want to be effective, or do you just want to have a goal, even if you fail to make it? Because one of the things you've implied with when you talk about risk is, what if your subordinates come back? What if your team comes back and says, we can't do that for this reason, but we could do this. We could make $80 million. We're confident we can do that. We think it's a credible plan. Should you adapt your plans? I almost think this is a taboo question, because the statement is that typically and throughout my career is, this is the task, go do the task. There seems to be no room to adapt or to change what that task is. What do you think about that? I mean, both of you have real world experiences. Have you ever gone back to your boss and said, boss, we're not going to do that, but we can do this?
Change the word task for outcome.
Yeah.
And you've changed everything.
But can you do that though? Because I think we're in a world where the premise of leadership, management, command is to achieve an outcome that some mysterious person behind a curtain declares must be true. The implication is you cannot change that. It all comes down from that person. Can you go back and change that person's mind? Is that allowed?
I think we're back to what we've talked about before in mission command, and the idea of separating out the outcome from the way that you go about achieving it.
But I'm going one step further. I'm saying, can you change the outcome?
Absolutely.
And I asked that question, not just the can you say no to people. That's I think lots of people would say, oh, you can say no. This was hard. I'm not going to do it. But actually, that can you not necessarily change the outcome? Can you say, we cannot achieve this outcome, but we could be more effective or have a greater chance of achieving this outcome? Which would you like? Would you like a 50% chance of failing at this activity, or would you like a 90% chance of succeeding in that activity?
If the culture of the organisation allows you to deal in outcomes, then you make your organisation much more agile, much more flexible, and you empower at the lowest possible level. Doesn't mean that's optimum, because you might be in circumstances where the box is so small, you are giving a task, it needs to be this, it's black and white, for time reasons, for whatever, in which case you must accept it. But there, the dialogue is still important. The dialogue is still important in terms of representing the risk. Be advised, we might not be able to achieve this, or we might have catastrophic success, in which case we will be able to go further. But that dialogue, that honest dialogue, is so important.
I think that's what I'm really getting at, because I think there is, we started with the concept of fear. And so we almost, and to use a phrase that lots of people, you almost have to fake it until you make it. You have to be confident, you have to project confidence. There's a point though at which that becomes self-defeating, when confidence says, I am unable and unwilling to listen to what's going on. So I think that's interesting. Well, look, we started by saying we'd talk about fear, uncertainty, and adaptability. And I'm afraid, I don't know if you saw what I did there, we only talked about fear, but frankly, I suspect we did actually touch on uncertainty and adaptability. But maybe that's a reasonable place to finish. Maybe we have to convince John to come back at some point in the future to carry on the conversation.
I think that would be wonderful. If I may, I think we started with talking about the individual fear, and we talked about it from the position of a new leader. And there was conversation about the difference between the fear of external factors, physical fear, and then the fear of failure, the fear of exposure. And I think what John has very articulately brought us to is this command relationship. And for me, I think by creating those very clear command lines, those bridges between the boxes, the very clear bounds of accountability, responsibility and authority, what you allow is the removal of the fear of exposure within the organisation, which allows individuals to be empowered to say, I'm not going to be able to achieve this, or these are the external risks that I face. And I think that is what is absolutely crucial when organisations are facing external complexities, because it's that dialogue, it's that communication, as we've talked about. So for me, the relationship between fear and command is about creating those bridges so that people are able to express their fears of the external environment, the risk, without feeling that they are exposed, without feeling that they're highlighting to their boss that they don't know what they're doing or they're inadequate. And that, I think, is absolutely crucial.
And I would just go on with one of my favourite subjects on this to take that forward, is the various platforms that allow these divergent views, this dialogue of command, whether it be red teaming, whether it be wargaming, whether it be what ifs, a whole number of wearing different hats. I was once in an organisation where the boss told me that whatever he said, I was to oppose him.
Yeah.
I was to disagree with him. He wanted his team to disagree with him in private for the intellectual exercise of opening up the debate. It was empowering to be told by your superior, whatever I say, your response is, I don't agree.
Yeah.
Out of principle.
I think, maybe we've got our very long list of podcast episodes. This has to be one of them, because my contention, which we talked about earlier, is that in the military, the concept of red teaming, the fact that you even have a term for it, is something which I have very, very rarely come across in the business world. I think the business world is focused on planning for an unknown future or a desired outcome. I think more often than not, it's not as good at saying what happens if it all goes wrong. How do you literally make a plan from scratch in 24 hours? And I think so we'll have to come back and do that.
Absolutely, and we will do a whole episode on wargaming, red teaming, measurement of effectiveness, and all the things that encompasses. I think that's probably about as far as we're going to go with this episode. So, John, thank you very much for your time. I know it's very valuable. Thank you for joining us. If you've liked what you've heard, then please do tell your friends about it. We'd also love for you to join the conversation, and we'd like to hear your stories, your ideas, or even your suggestions for future topics. You can follow us, suggest future topics and ask questions by engaging with us on our Twitter at battlingwithbiz, that's biz with a Z. But for now, though, thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, goodbye.